Hello, and welcome to another episode of Dead Times, the only horror movie podcast recorded on a ham radio in a tool shed. I'm your host, Peter, and with me, as always, is the guy who watches me drink water with a bag over his head, Tim. Tim, how are you doing?
I'm doing just fine, and I'm very, very glad that that's not my job anymore. At least for the time being, because I was running out of material.
So tonight we're going to be talking about The Strangers, which came out in 2008 and has become one of the more influential horror films of the last decade or so. There are a lot of both parodies and a lot of homages to it, and it really opened up the genre of home invasion movies that became and still is quite popular in the last 10 years. So what were your initial thoughts about The Strangers?
On the whole, I think I liked it. There are parts of it that I think are really, really good. I didn't really come away feeling like I had anything really substantial to take away from it. It didn't particularly move me at all, but just viewing it as an exercise in being scary, which I think is sort of all it's meant to be, I think parts of it are really, really effective. Yeah, on the whole, I approve.
Yeah, this is as stripped to the bones of a horror movie as you could possibly have.
Basically, yeah.
Even with our protagonists, we know next to nothing about them, and what we do know is generally pretty much just implied. One of the things that this movie has been praised for is the fact that the killers have literally no discernible motivation and are never given anything even resembling a motivation throughout this movie.
Yeah, except that they were home.
Yeah. And I think that has really filtered into the larger horror genre and even beyond that. A few years ago, Saturday Night Live did a parody of Wes Anderson that was basically what a Wes Anderson movie would look like if it was a horror movie, called The Midnight Coterie of Sinister Intruders, which was basically just what The Strangers would look like if it was directed by Wes Anderson.
That sounds awesome. I demand a full-length version.
It is actually really entertaining. But the creepy masks, the home invasion, everything about this movie eventually has snowballed into being a much more prominent throughout all of horror. Reasonably soon we're going to be dealing with The Purge, which is almost ripping this movie off to an extraordinary degree, other than the fact that it gives everyone much more characterization and motivation for what they're doing.
Yeah, and of course, You're Next clearly borrowed a lot from this, which I think that might be I think that this is roughly the movie that I thought You're Next was going to be, and then You're Next decided to subvert that, and that's the part about it that I didn't like, because I was settling in for this movie and I was ready to enjoy it in the way that I did ultimately enjoy this movie, and then Your Next started fucking with me in a way that I didn't really appreciate. I was gonna have fun watching that movie that you were gonna do, and it started making fun of me for wanting to watch that movie.
Yeah, Your Next is definitely deconstructing this idea. There's a movie called Don't Breathe that's also basically trying to deconstruct this idea.
I've heard of that movie.
Yeah, home invasion movies have become... Well, home invasion movies, there have always been a few here and there, but they've become much more popular in the last decade or so, pretty much since this movie came out, and a lot more prominent. And I've read articles describing home invasion movies that it's all symbolic of the fact that the home represents America and the invaders represent the great unwashed masses.
Right, yeah.
I don't really buy that much. With home invasion movies, I think they are the most literal horror genre. I think they are the most masculine horror genre. I think that when you look at
you got to protect your house and home.
Yeah, I think that when you look at who makes home invasion movies, everyone that I know of has been directed and written by a man. And I think when you look at that all together, it is what is the most frightening thing that, a heterosexual upper middle class writer, director would be afraid of, and that would be this situation.
Yeah, basically.
I think The Purge is going to take this to a much more interesting metaphorical place, even if the first Purge movie doesn't necessarily follow through on what all of its metaphors mean. But I think on a very basic level, this is what terrifies a family man, that they are frightened that someone is going to come in their house and kill their family.
Yeah, I was looking at some thoughts that people had about this movie since I didn't have too many, and I wanted to see what other people had. And I remember sort of along those lines of that reading of it, of it being sort of a political thing in a way. I know there was one person talking about this movie who was saying, less of it being a particular allegory, but they were saying that it's a depiction of what we think of violence being in the post-September 11th world, that it's just random, can happen at any time to anyone for no particular reason that they were aware of, and places that they thought were completely safe. And like at first I was like, okay, yeah, there's kind of something there, but then I was like, no, but invasion of safe spaces has been what the horror genre has been all about since forever. Like that's kind of the whole thing, is that there are monsters or ghosts or crazy people that can come and kill you in places that you think they can't. Like that's kind of the premise of the genre. So I don't know if this movie is really all about that idea in a way that every other horror film isn't.
Home invasion movies are a subgenre of slasher movie. The hallmarks of a home invasion movie is that it takes place continuously, whereas a slasher movie like Scream will take place over days, that no one leaves the home invasion and goes someplace else. Like you can't pick up a home invasion movie and move it to another location, and usually that there are multiple assailants. I can't think of one where that I've seen that has only had one killer in it, except for possibly Don't Breathe, which is a deconstruction of the entire concept.
But I was thinking in some ways like you could maybe trace the whole genre back to in a way, or it's not a direct line, but it seems like a lot of them owe a lot to Black Christmas, where it's just one dude.
Like I said, it's a subgenre of slasher movies. If you looked at The Strangers and said, well, this is a slasher movie, would you be wrong?
I mean, I guess not particularly, although I mean slasher movies tend to be defined by, or at least from the limited amount that I've seen, by a string of death. At a certain point through the movie someone dies, then a little while later someone else dies, then someone else dies, and in this nobody dies at all until the end.
Well, one person does die halfway through the movie.
Oh yeah, there's that, but it isn't sort of the spine of the movie in the way that it is for a lot of others. I don't know how you even really define slasher movie exactly. You could say that that this whole genre is a subgenre of slasher movie,
which again, it's the entire idea of genreization is very, very tricky, because genres are messy, art is messy, they fold over into each other, they include things they include elements of other genres. Like, I think this is reasonably as much of pure horror movie as you could hope to get, but it also has a whole bunch of elements of like domestic dramas.
Yeah, which again is nothing new. We've been we just talked about The Babadook. That's a great example of that. Yeah, and I like Lindsay Ellis's view of genre, which I'm sure is not original to her, but I remember her talking about it recently, which is that genre names are most useful as retronyms, that you can look back on a group of movies or books or whatever sometime after the fact and realize that there were certain things that they had in common, and come up with a name for those movies or those stories that shared those things, and that it's more useful to apply that way as sort of a scholarly term than as something to apply to a movie that just came out, and then we now that it's out and we can say this movie is this genre, or a filmmaker saying I've decided to make a movie in such and such genre, that it's not really all that useful that way, as more than kind of a casual conversational device.
To the extent, like I've talked about, that I take a very, very broad view of genre, and genre that you can look back on it and say, oh, like the people making Godzilla did not know we were going to make a new genre of film.
No.
And like one of the ways to determine genre is that you look at the chain of influence. Like Your Next is influenced by The Strangers, which is influenced by, in particular, it seems to be influenced by Friday the 13th Part 2, along with some other early examples of home invasion movies. Like they're being influenced by these same works.
Yeah.
And that it is also a marketing term, that you put a book in the horror section or a movie in the sci-fi section or whatever where you put it, is so that a consumer can very easily go and find something that they might like.
Yeah, they can be useful that way, certainly. But then again, you'll get confusion with that. You'll remember back in our unreleased pilot episode for this show, we talked about It Comes at Night, and about how a lot of people were disappointed with that movie because it was marketed as a horror movie, and people went into it with certain expectations because it was placed into that genre, a lot of which weren't really met, because that movie is unsettling and disturbing in parts, but it's not the movie that was pitched by the advertising. And part of that, I think, is the genre that it was placed into. And so if people went into it looking for like a post-apocalyptic thriller, then they would have been, or they might have been more satisfied with what they got. But I don't even know if that really is much of a genre, because Mad Max Fury Road is a post-apocalyptic thriller, but it's nothing like It Comes at Night. So lumping it into that category wouldn't really do much good either. I think that the concept of genre makes a lot of things easier, but it also makes certain things more difficult.
As I've said on this podcast before, I take a very expansive view of genre, that what counts as a horror movie includes a whole lot of things that people would like to throw under thriller or all sorts of other different science fiction, some fantasy.
Children's movies.
Yeah, they all influence each other. And the reason why this is a horror movie podcast is because of the fact that that is a genre that I don't think gets the appreciation that it deserves for its artistic and sociopolitical and intellectual merit.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree.
And which is something that we've come back to several different times over the course of this podcast. And part of that is that people like to narrowly define it, or narrowly define works as horror movies, instead of being like, well, this is a work that has horror elements, but also has comedic elements, or whatever else you might have.
Yeah, and that part of the snobbishness towards the genre is because when an entry in the genre possesses certain aesthetic qualities that sort of the critical elite really like, that then oftentimes in their mind, then that makes it not part of that genre, that it transcends that genre. That's how people talk about Silence of the Lambs, or The Exorcist, or lots of other really critically acclaimed horror films. Is that again, they start using we talked about this like in our last episode, that they start using phrases like it's more than a horror film, or is so compelling that it ceases to be something you can pigeonhole as horror, or and stuff like that. And that's just kind of insulting to the genre. The idea that if something is good enough, then that means it's not part of that.
And like I said, is that part of what the purpose of this podcast. When I originally came up with the idea for this podcast, there were several different goals that I wanted to have. One of which was that I wanted to do all of the holiday movies, because horror for some reason has become not horror as an entire literary genre, but horror, just specifically horror films, have become so intimately tied to holidays for very weird and fascinating reasons. But another part of what I want to do is I want to look at all of the new release horror movies, the modern horror movies, and put them within the context of what had come before, which is what we're basically doing right now, because The Strangers has a new movie coming out now. It's 10 years later, and it's having its sequel, Strangers Prey at Night,
which I'm very, very curious to see, because I don't really know how you could do a sequel to this. That would feel like a development. All I can picture is that it's just the same movie where they kill different people. Like, that's all I can envision a sequel to this being.
Part of that is I really wanted, throughout the length of this podcast, show how the modern horror movies are influenced by older examples. And it's going to be really, really interesting how Strangers Prey at Night either acknowledges or disregards things like You're Next and Don't Breathe that took the home invasion genre and transformed it from what The Strangers did to it. But let's jump into the movie itself. At what point did you realize this was going to be a home invasion movie?
I guess when I saw the poster when I was putting it on, or the DVD cover rather, that just kind of that is kind of what it is on its face. You put together pretty quick, even just once really when the bad guys just start to make their presence known, you kind of figure like, okay, well, there's not gonna be a really long time frame for this, so this is probably gonna be our only setting.
The movie itself has a very interesting, very, very traditional for horror movies opening, where there's basically a 911 call about how there are all these dead people, and then it goes into an immaculately done voiceover about how there's so much violent crime in the United States, according to the FBI.
That really didn't work for me, that voiceover. Like I felt like that voiceover section didn't really jive with the rest of the movie. I don't know, something about it. It just seemed like kind of a silly way to open this movie, because the rest of the movie is such a again, like you were saying, it's such a pure sort of exercise in filmmaking, but then having this prologue where it's like it's the inner world guy, you know, talking about how, you know, this kind of thing happens every day. And I don't know, that really kind of bothered me a little bit. But and I forgot about it pretty quick as the movie went on, because I got sucked into the actual movie that they were making. But as a setup, I didn't really think that was all that awesome. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, well, it's a pretty direct reference back to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which also purported to be real events that really took place, even though in both cases it definitely did not take place.
Yeah, this is inspired by true events in the sense that Fargo is inspired by true events, which is to say that it is not inspired by true events in any way.
Horror has a long-standing tradition of having completely fictional events be said to be inspired by true events. The actual inspiration for these events were the Manson murders, and specifically what the victims of the Manson murders felt like and at the time they were going on, because of course they had never heard of Charles Manson and had no idea why any of these people were doing this.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
And that the writer-director got fascinated by this idea of the fact that, well, you don't have these concrete explanations for why someone is doing something, or even like anything resembling a concrete explanation for why someone is doing something while it's happening to you. But yeah, nothing like this actually happened.
Yeah, and I felt like that prologue was sort of, I don't have a problem with sensationalism really. That's why I eat it up every time Insidious has its title card. But it didn't really seem like, because there's nothing really, because like Insidious is pulpy. It's pulpy to its core, whereas this movie again is such like a pure exercise in the craft of horror filmmaking. It's almost Kubrickian in a way, because it's just so lean, just so focused on just making this movie. And that prologue just felt kind of tacked on, and it felt like it was trying to sort of overly sensationalize something which is already pretty gripping, and is gripping as a movie. And again, as I was saying, is not particularly gripping in any other way. Like it didn't really leave me with anything to think about. I certainly wasn't left thinking, wow, like this kind of thing happens all the time. Like the prologue was like no, like no, it doesn't. I don't know. Just seemed like literally if there was just a cut of this movie where it just started 5 minutes in and just didn't have that, like I think that I would be totally cool with that.
We then meet our main characters, Kristen and James, who were at an event just prior to this movie and are now at James's father's summer house or cabin or something like that. That is kind of in the country, but also kind of not.
Yeah, it's not really clear where they are exactly.
Everyone's made a big deal about the fact that we know nothing about the killers, but we also kind of know nothing about Kristen and James. We know that they were just at an event. I assumed that the event was a wedding, but they never actually say it's a wedding.
Yeah, and we know that they were a thing and that James proposed to her and she turned him down. And then they came out here.
Although we honestly don't even know that necessarily for sure, because no one says I turned him, or Kristen never says I turned him down. Now that it's James, they just say,
but he's miserable and is like, please don't make me take this back. And she says, I'm sorry, it didn't go the way you wanted. So I think it's pretty clearly implied.
It's clearly implied, but it's just another example of how little we know about these characters. Is that this is the big setup for like what is happening, and we don't know really like even the most minor details. We don't know why she turned him down, because she turned him down, and yet they still wind up going to this out of the way country home, and they still seem like they might not have had the talk about whether or not they're going to break up. At one point they are about to have sex. Like it's all very, very complicated.
Yeah.
The thing is that the movie is deliberately withholding massive amounts of details that would normally be readily available in a movie like this.
Yeah, and I have really mixed feelings about that, because again, on the one hand, I get it that they are supposed to be every man and every woman, but at the same time, I like being invested in characters, and I like being particularly concerned about them when bad things happen to them, rather than just kind of the base level of concern that I have for just another human being. I feel like, again, I'm kind of torn, because I appreciate the movie taking a stand at not meeting me in the middle and doing that, and just saying, no, we're just gonna do this thing. We're not gonna, the movie's not saying I'm gonna make you care about these people. I'm just gonna show you this thing. I'm gonna show you this sequence of events. And Like I have like a real respect for that, but at the same time, I feel like I might have gotten more been more interested by the movie if it did characterize its main cast a little bit more.
What did you think about Scott Speedman and Liv Tyler's performances?
They're both really good. I thought Liv Tyler was great when she has more to do, since there are long stretches in the movie where Scott Speedman isn't around, and they do a good job at the beginning of seeming kind of awkward and depressed, and they do a good job throughout the rest of the movie of being scared and angry. But I mean, that's kind of it.
Yeah, I think that whatever empathy you have for these characters is generated through their performances because, like I said,
Yes.
they aren't given much to do, and so much of it rests on both of them being able to emote. I mean, the movie's very, very short, so when I say that, like, this section of the movie dealing with them and their possible breakup, but maybe not, / we don't really know what is going on, is so much of it is driven by just their ability to convey very complicated and complex emotions that are kind of contradictory to each other.
Yeah, and I think if you had lesser actors in these roles, then the movie really wouldn't work at all.
Like, and it is a very different thing to, for example, Insidious, where Lin Shaye has to deliver these incredibly long monologues about who she is, what the world is, where her emotional journey is. They have so little to work with, and yet they have to make all of it work.
Yeah, and I think they do. I think they do a pretty good job of that by and large. But yeah, again, it is just such a, what characterization there is so thin. And again, it's not like they seem like particularly shallow characters, or like they're archetypical or stereotypical or anything like that. It's just that we don't know anything about them. They might be fascinating characters. They have really good music taste.
The second time I watched it, I spent a little bit of time wondering whether or not they were actually like sort of hipstery people who had a record player, or whether it was like a really, really old record player.
Right, that James's dad just had.
Which I am deeply curious about. And stuff like that. Normally in a horror movie, or in any movie really, things such as the set would reflect what the characters are supposed to be, what their personalities are. And again, this movie goes out of its way that this is not their house. They had no say in any of it. And as far as I know, James didn't even have a room in that house from his childhood or anything.
Yeah, and Kristen has never been there, presumably.
Yeah. After a lot of, well, not necessarily a lot in time, but as a percentage of the movie, a lot of time dealing with these conflicting impulses, they wind up starting to have a sexual encounter, but that's interrupted by a knock on the door. And they go over to the door, and their front porch light is out, and there's a woman there, kind of bathed in shadow, who is asking if Tamara is at the house. They tell her no, she's not here. And they both kind of act very unsettled about this encounter, because it does take place at 4 in the morning. It's very explicitly 4 in the morning when this movie is taking place. And one of the more interesting details is that after the woman leaves, James immediately reaches over and discovers that the front porch light isn't out because of like any electrical problem or the light bulb's burn out. It's out because of the fact that the bulb is unscrewed.
Oh, I didn't put that together until now. I remembered that scene playing out, but I didn't think about, okay, that's actually really clever. But yeah, and the Tamara thing never comes back. It's never really clear why this woman, who turns out to be one of the killers, did this. Why they didn't just come in and start trying to kill them. Why they went through this whole rigmarole of pretending they were at the wrong house. It's never explained at all why they bothered to do this.
And yet, that is something that, again, has been referenced many, many, many times since this movie. Like in VHS, there is one of the segments has a woman coming up to their door and asking if so-and-so is at their house. Well, actually, I think it's a motel room in that segment, but there is something really creepy about someone coming to your door and it being the wrong person.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, and it's a creepy scene. It's just never really made sense of. Like a lot of things in this movie. It is never given any context that you're like, oh, that's why she did the whole like asking for Tamara things. Like, no, that moment never comes.
One of the things about this movie that is so creepy is the fact that the killers are just entering and exiting this house whenever they want to, and it's rarely called attention to. Kristen notices a couple of things, like she notices that her cell phone's gone, or like that the smoke detector has been moved or something like that. But there's some times where it's just never called attention to, like the fact that Kristen will lock a door, and then like 2 or 3 scenes later, that door will be mysteriously unlocked, which I think is probably what this movie does so much better than virtually any other movie, is that it has these incredibly long scenes of just the characters and the killers being in the same scene and being unaware.
Yes, or one of them isn't aware, and this is my favorite thing about this movie. And we've we've talked about this in a couple episodes, is that I'm always want there to be more sequences in horror movies like this, where whatever the evil presence is, whether it's a crazy person or a ghost or whatever, is just in frame, just on camera for a decent period of time without it being called attention to, without our protagonists noticing them, and without there being like creepy music, like the music's being like, you see him, he's back there, dun, 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 dun. That, like, yeah, there's a really long sequence before during the first scene where things start to go really bad while James is out getting cigarettes or something, I think, and it's just Kristen left alone, and she's just walking around the room, and you just see in the background just somebody with a spooky mask just standing like 10 feet away watching her, but nothing about how the scene is shot calls attention to that. There's no musical cue, there's no like zoom in on him or anything like that. He's just a part of the scenery in the background for a good solid couple minutes during this shot, and then he goes away, and like that is terrifying to me. Like that is so much scarier than a lot of the other ways that movies will handle that sort of thing. I complained about this in some of the Insidious movies, and there are parts of the Insidious movies which also will do that, especially in the first two, where there will just be a demon or a ghost just in the shot, uncommented on, pretty briefly. But in the second two, and in parts of the first two, it gets to be that the only moments in which you see anything not human in those movies is the character turning around, or closing a suitcase, and there's a creepy face there, and then the music goes blah, and then it's gone, and then that's it, and you just absorb what our bad guys look like just from the incremental split seconds of that you get several of. And that I'm not inherently opposed to jump scares. I think they can be used well, but when it's the only way that you ever get a look at your antagonistic forces, then it doesn't do any favors for the atmosphere. You don't get a sustained feeling of dread, because you sort of pick up the pattern, and you know that as soon as the jump scare is over, most of the time, unless you're in the final 15 minutes of the movie, that there will be a blam, and then you'll be okay, because the whole like rhythm of the thing is that then the protagonist isn't in danger anymore. Whereas having these guys just be in the background for a little bit, and then for that whole time you're just wondering, like, is he gonna walk over and stab her, or what is he gonna do, because you don't know. And so then you have a good solid couple minutes of being on the edge of your seat rather than just a split second of being shaken. And so that to me is a lot more effective.
One of the things that I like about this movie is that it's clear that this group of killers is not there just to kill them, because they have so many hundreds of opportunities where they could kill these people, and they just don't ever take them until they reach whatever point it is that they decide that they're done.
Yeah. But at the same time, like, they clearly want to kill these people just for sadism. That it's just so that these people die. They're not killing them because they're rich and they'll get their money or something, or just to rob their house or steal their stuff. Like, they're there to cause random death, but they prolong it for some reason. Again, that's never explained.
What did you think about the fact that our killers are a man and two women?
I was just wondering the whole time just what the origin of this group of people was, because I guess there's something, because that's the thing, is that there are lots of movies about one random crazy guy who's just going to kill people just because. We've talked about a couple on this podcast. Black Christmas is like that. Halloween is sort of like that. There are lots of movies about isn't it scary that there are crazy psychos out there that will just kill anything in front of them, and they just sort of will stumble around aimlessly just murdering people. But yeah, in the fact that in this movie, yeah, it's a fairly sizable force of psychopaths who were apparently able to rally around one common sick desire for death, that they were okay with indulging in roughly the same way. Like, it's really, really weird, and you have no idea what the backstory to these people could possibly be. And the last line in the movie seems to imply that this was the first time that they had done this. So whatever that history was, it would seem to be fairly recent, because they haven't been doing this for very long. So yeah, I wondered about that a lot.
In most of the Scream movies, there are two killers, where one was sort of recruited by the other.
Yeah, and again, despite that joke made in the first movie, every killer in Scream has a very, very clearly defined motivation.
And I think that there is something fascinating about the fact that it is a man and two women. The perception that I have is that the man is the leader, but that might be completely wrong.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I kind of got that vibe some of the time, but yeah, I don't know.
And so are they brothers and sisters? And then particularly since even when their masks come off, the movie is shot and staged so that you never get a clear look at what their faces are, even though in some of the shots you theoretically could have if it wasn't shot like so far away, or so you don't get like, well, necessarily what are the ages of these people. It's all just this giant mystery even when the masks come off.
But at the same time, but we do get to hear them speak, or we get to hear at least one of them speak. And
I think the only one that speaks is the blonde woman.
Who's the one asking for Tamara? Yeah, and we get to hear her speak a couple of lines there at the end. And something about the fact that part of it isn't pure. Like there's just like this little reminder in there that no, there are faces that can speak behind those masks, or maybe there aren't. There's a theory coming to me now. Maybe she's the leader, and maybe the other two are crazy enough that they don't even speak, and that because she's the one who there at the end says it'll be easier next time.
Like I said, the only reason why I think the man is the leader is because of the fact that he's the one that's sort of dragging bodies around and putting them in positions where he wants them. It could very easily have been the blonde woman was the leader, or the brown-haired woman was the leader. We don't know. We know literally nothing about these people. And the creepiest thing to me about the ending is that, well, number one, they're creepy no matter what they do, because they're asking for a pamphlet and they're doing it in the most creepy way possible. And number two, that their life is just going to continue on from this point.
And might be caught at some point, might not be.
Yeah, and they have some version of normal for them that includes this.
Yeah, and that is a deeply upsetting thought.
Well, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but they leave the house and they just are driving around in a truck and talk to some Mormon missionaries and take a pamphlet. And it's like, well, yeah, they're going to be like going to the local diner and then doing whatever it is they do for money. That whatever their version of a normal life is includes this, and just includes like all the other stupid stuff humans do.
Yeah, and that's And that is really frightening.
They aren't Michael Myers, who is literally doing nothing until Halloween arrives and then goes and tries to kill his family. It's a very disturbing thought.
Yeah, definitely.
But anyway, so the blonde woman leaves, and James calls his friend Mike to come pick him up, but then he basically decides to leave by himself. And Liv Tyler takes a bath, and she changes her outfit, and then that's when she has a cigarette, and then she goes to get herself a drink of water, and that's when in the background the man is standing there watching her. And yeah, it is very, very creepy. And you get the sense that she senses something is wrong, but doesn't know necessarily what it is, based off of Liv Tyler's performance. But then there's another knock at the door, and it's the woman again asking for Tamara. And Kristen tells her that that she's already been here, Tamara is not here. And the knocking winds up getting much more violent. And well, she goes to get her cell phone, and her cell phone is not charged, so she plugs it in and starts charging it. Before he left, James made a fire for her, and then all of a sudden smoke starts billowing out of the fireplace, which causes her to go knock down the smoke detector, and then she winds up calling James and asking him to come back to the house because of the fact that she's frightened. Which, and again, this is another very, very subtle thing that I like about these sort of subtle details in this movie, is that the fire mysteriously starts billowing smokes into the room, and then as soon as she is done knocking out the smoke detector, it stops. So clearly that they were on the roof doing something to the fireplace.
Yeah, and what it seems like they're doing all throughout this first part of the movie is cutting off all means of exit and contact with the outside world. So they sabotage the cars, get rid of both of their phones. Maybe they thought they could climb up the chimney. I don't know, because they don't lock the doors really, or find any way to stop them from getting outside any other ways. So yeah, who the fuck knows what they were doing to the chimney or why.
Yeah, I will point out that this is a movie with 2 cell phones and 1 landline, all of which proved to be useless.
Yeah.
Actually, no, 3 cell phones, because Mike also has a cell phone.
Which is also useless.
She ends up calling James on the landline, but that is immediately cut off, which I guess this is a neutral landline as opposed to the landlines that keep trying to kill you in all these other movies. But yeah, so she looks out a window and sees the man in the bag leering at her and starts screaming and grabs a butcher knife, and retreats to a bedroom.
Which is good reaction time for a horror movie. Kristen realizes that some shit is up and is like, okay, knife, corner.
She initially tries to hide under the bed, which I don't think would be particularly a good plan in this situation. But yeah, she takes out the light, she grabs a knife, she hides in the corner. Like, that's one of the things about both Kristen and James, is that they are reasonably intelligent about the situation they're in.
Yeah, they're not what's her name from You're Next, but they're not doing too bad, all things considered.
Most of their plans are either pick a location that seems secure and then wait with a weapon, go find a means of contacting someone else, or go find a means of transportation. And it's just that these killers happen to be really, really good at dealing with all those situations. But yeah, she's in the corner and she hears someone rummaging about the house, and it turns out to be James back from wherever he was going to come and help her. And she's sort of insistent that there's someone stalking her, and he's very dismissive about it. She finds all sorts of little things around the house that have been moved around. Again, her cell phone's missing. They don't notice the fact that the cell phone had been taken and thrown into the fire. And they do a decent enough job of searching the house, again, fairly intelligent on their part, to make sure that there is no one in the house. But then they notice that the blonde woman is way down at the end of the street just looking at their house. Yeah, she's far enough away that I don't know if they know that she's wearing a mask, but they do say she looks like a ghost.
Yeah, and with the way that these guys move around, maybe they are, because like they will just like vanish completely from the shot that they were in a second.
So eventually James decides that he's going to go get his cell phone, which is in the car, and while he's getting his cell phone, the blonde woman sneaks up behind him and touches his neck, which causes him to freak out, and then the glass in the front of his window explodes. Which is another thing, is that we don't know even what that was. There's a lot of stuff that happens in this movie where we don't know what that was. Like, there's a point where it looks like they're throwing black paint at the house, but we don't know if that's paint or blood or oil or whatever else it might be. It's just a dark liquid. Where they got it, how they're throwing it at the house.
Yeah. Again, there's just we're gonna be saying we don't know a lot in this episode.
Yeah, which I think is kind of fascinating about the fact that they don't bother to over-explain literally anything, or even really explain anything. It's just, you're not supposed to be wondering, like, obviously we're wondering because of the fact that we do a podcast about it, so we have time to sit there and ponder, but when you're in the moment, you're not wondering, well, okay, did they fill water balloons with oil and start throwing them at the house? You just know things are going splat and something terrible is happening.
Yeah, and again, that's basically all you get.
James attempts to escape with Kristen using their car, but their entire driveway is covered in broken glass, and then the other female killer drives up behind them with the male killer directly in front of them, so they are effectively trapped in this driveway, and they retreat back into the house. The killers start coming in with an axe through the front door, so they barricade the front door, and they discover the battery has been removed from James's phone, and he finds a gun that his father had, and yet another tidbit of characterization that we don't know anything else about is the fact that he told Kristen that his father took him hunting, but he reveals that he had never been hunting and he's never actually loaded the gun and is not entirely certain if he knows how.
But it turns out that he did it right.
Yeah, and so again, they retreat into a corner in the bedroom with a plan of literally just waiting with a gun until help arrives, even though they don't really have any means of contacting help. Meanwhile, Mike, who is James's friend, who he called before to pick him up, arrives, and he himself is very startled when something hits his windshield, and again, he feels something is horribly wrong and enters their house through a window where the glass has been broken. Meanwhile, the blonde killer is sort of emerges from the shadows of the door behind him, and then Mike is basically gingerly walking through the house, and as he's walking through it, he's being followed by various killers, particularly the man, and he makes his way to the bedroom, and eventually the very predictable thing happens of the fact that James shoots him in the head, killing him.
Yeah.
Poor Mike, played by Glenn Howerton from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia.
Yeah, he was in this movie for all of 5 minutes, maybe.
Yeah, so what'd you think about James killing his friend?
That was something else that I wasn't that big of a fan of, just because it seemed like it introduced some complexity that didn't really go anywhere. That, like, it seemed like it was wanting to pile things on these people. Like, well, not only they're trying to survive, but now this guy's gonna have to deal with the fact that he shot his friend in the face, and like he's dealing with this trauma while all this other stuff is going on. But it never really made anything of it, and it didn't really. I don't know. It seemed sort of unnecessary. It seemed sort of unnecessarily cruel and ironic, for a movie that had I've been that up to that point and after that point is cruel in a very natural sort of way. Again, it was making me think of You're Next, and like again, you're like a lot of the stuff that I enjoyed about You're Next was ruined by, for me personally, by the feeling that it was leaning into black humor in a lot of ways, which by and large this movie pretty much avoids. In this movie, it's pretty just straight edge scary. And I think one of the first things I said about Your Next was that the reason I didn't like it so much is that I'm not a fan of the model of the movie as a protracted sick joke, and that was like the one thing in this movie that like seemed like the movie was presenting it as kind of just a sick joke. And that kind of bothered me, just because again it didn't feel like it was really in keeping with the tone of the rest of the events.
Well, obviously Mike's dead body is lying around for everyone to step over the course of the rest of the movie, but the only time that it actually comes up again is that, which is almost immediately, is that the killers mockingly put killer on the window. But yeah, behind their house is a tool shed, and in the tool shed is a ham radio, and James decides to make a run for the ham radio with the shotgun, and he sees one of the killers basically just wandering around, but as he's about to shoot her, he gets ambushed by the man, and then he's out of the movie for most of the rest of the running time.
It becomes kind of a one girl show.
Which Liv Tyler, she stays in the house for a little bit, but then also decides to make a run for the ham radio, and she's a little bit more careful because when she's making her initial run, the killers aren't particularly around, but she winds up tripping and horribly injuring her leg, so she's going to be limping for the rest of the movie. And she does crawl into the tool shed, where one of the killers has had an axe for this entire movie, and you discover that the axe was taken from that tool shed.
Yeah.
Which again, like one of the things I like about this movie is the fact that the killers are just doing stuff in the background that the movie never calls attention to, really, the fact that they're doing these things until, like, this is one of the more attention-calling moments, is the fact that you see, oh, there's an outline of an axe on this wall. That is the axe that the killers have been using throughout this entire movie. But Kristen gets the ham radio, and she can't get anyone on until she can, and then when she's about to call for help, one of the other killers, who's been also in the tool shed, because it's a fairly big tool shed, comes up behind the ham radio and just smashes it to pieces. Which again, what I find fascinating about this, or another thing I find fascinating about this movie, is that presumably that woman, the brown-haired woman, knew where Kristen was the whole time, because Kristen is talking, and the ham radio is making static sounds, but she doesn't actually make a move on either of them until there's actually someone else on the line, and that's when she decides to destroy it.
Yeah, it's just the way that these people operate is so bizarre and so inexplicable in a lot of ways. And we just never get any closure or any. I guess it's just that they're nuts. Is the idea is that they're not really thinking logically, but it never gives you any insight really into what their mindset is or why they do things the way that they do. Again, why they don't kill these two just immediately, which it seems like they could absolutely do. And again, that seems to be their only end goal. It's really strange, and again, it's probably the most fascinating thing about this movie is because it keeps you on your toes because you don't know what they're gonna do.
Kristen flees the tool shed, and the killers are sort of just hanging around. The blonde woman's on a swing. The male killer is just sort of there. Kristen winds up getting back into the house, and in a reversal of the previous scene, the male killer is wandering through the house, and he does not know where she is while she is watching him, and she sneaks into a pantry closet, and she is momentarily safe.
Yeah, and there's another great extended shot of her watching out into the room, watching the male killer kind of shuffle around and then sit down at the table and then get up and shuffle away, which is really, really creepy. Because again, given how kind of unpredictable this movie is, it follows the way that a scene like that normally plays out, where she is watching him and, is terrified she's going to be discovered, and then is not discovered by him anyway, and, and is able to exhale a little bit. But because of the way this movie works, you really don't know if he might just look over and see her peeking through and just walk over and open the door, because that would be kind of a typical move for this movie. So, it's put you in a mindset where that scene is still really, really suspenseful.
Yeah, and particularly because of the fact that, like you said, he sits down at the table for a bit. I mean, obviously he's been looking for her, but that isn't like all he is. Like, he just decides to take a break in the middle of this home invasion. That is really creepy.
Yeah, and yet, well, and that's the thing is, who knows? Maybe he did see her. Maybe he saw her in there and was like, okay, she's there. She's not going anywhere because I'm in the room. I can sit down for a sec. And then maybe as soon as he was off screen, he gestured for one of the girls to then go and get her out.
Because that's exactly what happens, that she thinks she's safe, and then the blonde woman immediately appears and starts beating her way through the pantry door. And then, literally, as the door is about to fall off, she retreats again. Is that what this movie, like we've said so many times in this, but what this movie does is so unsettling for the fact that these killers could have killed her at any time. Like, she's just in the pantry, she's just alone, and they already have the door broken down, and they just back off, which allows Kristen to escape back into the kitchen, and she gets a very tiny knife. And I'm honestly not certain if she attempts to reason with the blonde killer or not, but she says that he's going to kill you, seemingly indicating that the man is going to be the one that would kill her, or maybe she's thinking about James, or who knows what. But she's trying to talk to the blonde killer, and it clearly doesn't work.
Yeah, and I guess, then maybe that's, that she was, that Kristen was assuming, like us, that, okay, the man must be the leader, he's, and is coercing these two into doing this. Like, I don't know. Again, I don't know what that's the thing, is that our main characters do almost as much stuff in this movie that's at least a little inexplicable as the killers do.
But she retreats back into the bedroom, and the killers bring James back in and tie him to a chair. And she inches out of the bedroom only to be assaulted by the man, who knocks her down and drags her across Mike's dead body and then ties her to a chair. And then they all take off their masks and individually just stab each of them. And again, they take off their masks, but it's all shot so you can't ever actually see their faces. They're literally just out of frame or even partially in frame in a few of the shots, but you just can't see their faces. And then they just leave. At this point, it's morning. They're in a pickup truck, and two Mormon missionaries are on bicycles going the other way. They stop the Mormon missionaries and ask for a pamphlet, and then get back in the pickup truck, and they talk about how next time will be easier. And the Mormon missionaries arrive at the house. They find Mike's dead body, they find James's dead body, and then they find Kristen's body. But as they're checking to see if she's still alive, it turns out she is, and then the movie ends. So what do you think about that?
Which means they didn't kill her. So what was the point? We're just gonna go to a random house at 4 a.m, make the people there scared for a couple hours, and then torture one of them to death, and just stab the other one a bunch, and just leave her there, and then go, what? And what is up with those missionaries? Because they're the two kids, because like their reaction to walking through this house full of full of everything broken and come upon what seems to be two dead bodies, like they're really deadpan and weird about it. And that whole exchange with the killers is really creepy. No, like the blonde woman gets out and asks for a pamphlet, and the kid looks at her and says, "Are you a sinner?" And the woman says, "Sometimes." And he gives her one, and she takes it, gets into the car, and as they're or the truck, as they're driving away, she says that thing I was talking about. She says, "It'll be easier next time," and that's it. And again, it's so baffling and unsettling all at the same time, which is kind of what a lot of this movie is. Yeah, and so then I guess that Kristen made that 9/11 call from the first movie after the movie ended, maybe, because we never hear her. She doesn't make it throughout the course of the movie, but then it's never explained really why in that call she says she doesn't know where she is. So I don't really know how that's all supposed to connect. I don't know, maybe that was after the boys called for help and got her away from there, and then she wasn't totally sure where she was when she got the opportunity to make I don't know. I don't know how any of that's supposed to work. That ending, I don't really know how to feel about the fact that it ends abruptly. On the one hand, it does seem sort of appropriate, but I guess I was sort of waiting. I wasn't consciously thinking about this, but I guess there was a part of me that was waiting for like a moment, like an aha moment, like a moment of clarity. And then the fact that it just stopped right there, like I was left sitting there. I was like, oh, okay, okay, that's a movie, I guess. it seems, again, I know it's the point, and I think it's done well, that the point is that there's something so kind of dry about this movie, and so I think it's sort of deadpan about a lot of it, which again is why I think that prologue doesn't fit, because it's sort of sensationalizing something that otherwise is very stripped stripped down and not, you don't get any, you very rarely get any sense that, this was put together in such a way so that it would be quote unquote good movie making. That's the thing, is that, this is not a true story, but it sort of goes about things with this kind of respect for the bare bones events that almost makes you think that it could be, because, if it wasn't based on a true story, then they could give it more of an arc. They could give it more of a climax or a denouement, but that it's like they're bound to this particular series of events that they have to portray faithfully and not add in any kind of Hollywood structure to it, except that, of course, it didn't happen. That it's just part of the style of the movie.
Yeah, I mean, the first time I saw this, I was literally waiting for what happened in Your Next, which is that even if they die at the end, they're going to have some sort of triumph over these killers. They're going to kill one of them at the very least, and that doesn't happen.
Nope.
Like, they have nothing they attempt in this movie succeeds. They never even have, they kind of don't even have a moment of respite.
No, not really. It's just after James is made aware that the killers are actually there, it is just this one long sequence of them trying to survive this that is never, there isn't really any up or down to it. And it's pretty rough. Like, it's a pretty intense sit, which I think is all it was really trying to be. So again, in that sense, it really, really works. But like, I was waiting for, that there would be, I don't know, a scene of Kristen talking to the police, and we would get some, I don't know, kind of philosophical waxings that would put, what we had just seen in context or in some kind of psychological context. That's sort of the Hitchcock thing, is that after bodies stop piling up, is that, we'll sit down with somebody smart who will, talk about what this all really means and what we all learned from this. But that doesn't happen at all in this movie. Again, since I don't really know how that call connects, we don't even really know if Kristen survives this. Like, okay, she's alive when they find her, but again, most movies like this where somebody survives, we're at least given some sense of, okay, they'll be really fucked up from this, but they'll make it through. Like, here it seems totally incidental that she survived. Like, this was not a story about a survivor in the way, the way that lots of slasher movies are. We've talked about Final Girls a lot.
Yeah, Kristen.
And like at the end of all of those movies, you do get the sense, okay, they're going to be able to carry on. They'll have some shit to deal with. They're really sad about the people who died, but they're gonna manage somehow. Like, we have no indication that Kristen will ever be able to move beyond this.
Yeah, Kristen is definitely not Sydney from Scream. Like, she only fits into the Final Girl idea because of the fact that she is the surviving girl, and she does spend a lot of the movie dealing with this alone. But yeah, she is deeply injured by the end of this movie, and like, there isn't, like, and a lot of times in these kind of movies they would end with sirens so that the authorities have arrived and are going
right.
to be helping
yeah there isn't even that. There is no authority presence in this movie at all.
The closest that we get is that phone call at the beginning of the movie, which does not indicate anything other than the fact that there are dead bodies.
Yeah, it's a pretty ruthless movie, all things considered. Which again, I admire it for, but I can't really say that I love this movie, because it's not one that I don't think I will ever be compelled to revisit, just because it is so kind of purely and exquisitely cruel that there isn't really much to latch onto there. But at the same time, I think possibly if they had tried to put substance in there, it would have sort of gotten in the way.
Well, I think that there is something to be said for a horror movie that is this stripped down to just its essential components.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you take out the credits, this is only like an hour and 12-minute long movie. And
it doesn't feel too quick. It doesn't feel like, oh man, they must have really cut that down. It's like, no, it sails right along.
Yeah, no, it is literally a movie that is just the essentials, but one of the essential things that this movie absolutely gets that too many horror movies don't get is that tension building and mood and atmosphere are all deeply important to horror movies, and there's so much of that here.
Yeah, and that really is the strength of the movie.
All right. Do you have any other thoughts about The Strangers, or possible thoughts about The Strangers Prey at Night?
Yeah, coming back to that, I have no idea what the sequel is going to be. If it is just this again, I will be somewhat annoyed, just because if it doesn't develop it in any way, then there's no reason for, if it's just this movie again with different people, then there will be no reason for it to have been a sequel. But at the same time, I don't know how you'd have to go pretty different to meaningfully distinguish a sequel from this movie. You would have to, I don't know, maybe they will give us some insight into the killers this time around. Maybe, we will get some history or something more about their their identity, and that would be different, but that would be different enough that it would feel like a separate movie, but it might be so different that it felt like a different franchise. Like, it seemed like when you have a movie this bare bones and this kind of fundamental in the way that it's executed, like, I don't know how you could make something similar enough to it that it felt like a continuation, but different enough that it didn't feel like just the same movie again. So I'm really, really curious as to what they do with it. And this is not a movie, unless I knew it from you picking this movie so that we could catch up in time, cover on the podcast, that I would never have expected there to be a sequel. Yeah. And I'm curious as to why they decided to make one 10 years later.
Yeah, no, I'm deeply curious how they're going to handle the 10-year time gap. If they're going to acknowledge it at all, have these people done this many, many, many times before? I suppose that there are lots of crimes that occur that don't make national press, but it feels like this would be one of those things that would be like a huge manhunt by the FBI type of thing, except maybe these people have literally not done anything in the intervening 10 years.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I'm just, again, we have nothing to go on. Like, that's the thing, is we have, like, this movie gives us so little to go on just for processing what happens in that. Like, I have no idea what's going to happen in the sequel. So yeah, I'm actually kind of really excited for that now, just because have there been trailers? Because it's coming out pretty soon, isn't it?
It's coming out in March.
What do the trailers indicate?
That is going to be set at a vacation stop where there are, like, people rent trailers in the woods. Seems to be a family as opposed to a couple.
Makes sense.
A lot of it seems to be the killers doing sort of things that they did in this movie.
And it is the same killers?
Yes. Well, at least the same masks.
All right. We'll see.
I saw the trailer for Strangers Prey at Night before Den of Thieves. I've seen it. I think it was in front of Insidious too, but I'm deeply curious. And you know, I'm kind of excited.
Yeah, I'm excited just because I have no idea what I'm gonna get.
It is the same writer, but it is not the same director.
That's slightly worrying, because the strength of this movie was definitely the directing and not the writing.
Yeah.
So, but I'm still curious.
Like, I want to keep an open mind about this.
I'm sorry. I was looking up the trailer on the internet, and one of the comments on the YouTube page is, "Tamara's still not home, idiots."
I want to keep an open mind about it. I think it could be really interesting in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I'm not particularly expecting a masterpiece, but I'm not expecting. I have no expectations.
Yeah, and I think that this is going to be a very different experience than Scream 4, which was similarly, there was a 10-year time gap.
Yeah, but you can't. Yeah, but Liam, but you can't comment on what came before in the way that you can with Scream, because there's so little to comment on.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's get to our final segment. Best death. Who had the best death, Mike or James?
I guess since Mike's death kind of pissed me off, I have to go with James's by default. Even though, again, there's nothing really distinctive about it. They just slowly, kind of aimlessly stab him until he dies, I guess. But yeah, the only other death in the movie was one of the only parts of the movie that I didn't really like. So I think I got to go with that one.
Yeah, I think I'm also going to go with James. I think that, to me, it's very, very creepy that, they took as long as they did. Like, they could have killed James literally any time for, like, seemingly a significant period of time while Kristen's off having all these adventures. They could have killed James at any point during any of this, and they didn't. They were specifically saving him for this, and then kind of all that they do is just stab him with a knife a bunch of times. And it's like, you've been terrorizing these people for hours now, and you specifically held them for this huge length of time, and your end game is literally just to stab him with a knife a couple of times. I think that makes them seem really disturbing. Like, that's what I find so many elements of this movie unsettling and disturbing.
Yeah, because I guess what it is that psychopaths, or sociopaths, or whatever the terminology is, are often portrayed as, just very cold and very just get straight to the point. Look at Michael Myers. Famously, the guy playing Michael Myers asked John Carpenter for motivation in one scene in the first movie, and Carpenter said his motivation was to move from point A to point B. Like a crazy supercomputer or an animal or something, and he just walks up to people and kills them as quickly as possible and moves on. Whereas these people behave, their demeanor is all very detached. They don't really talk too much, and they seem to do things very deliberately and very methodically, but they clearly seem to be doing it with passion in a way that, you know, somebody like Michael Myers doesn't. That, like, if I had to have a takeaway from all of the weird, inconsistent shit they do all throughout this movie, it's that they were doing this for enjoyment, and that they wanted to prolong the enjoyment of doing this, which goes against a little bit, I guess, that line at the end where she said it'll be easier next time. But that's the only explanation I can think of, and that just makes it all the more frightening because there is something human about it. You can see something recognizable in that, in wanting to take your time with doing something that is fun for you, even though for these people it's something just unthinkably horrible. I guess my final point is that the killers in this movie are all Pennywise. Yeah, because there have been similar complaints with both filmed versions of that story of people saying, "Oh, why does he take so long to kill these kids?" He just fucks with them for like 3 months before he actually does something. And there's kind of just as shaky an explanation there. James's death is really unnerving in that light, especially.
All right. Well, that would be The Strangers. Thank you for tuning in. I've been your host, Peter.
I continue to be Tim.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.
So long.
Camera's not home.
Idiots.